Chico police arrested a man for murder after detectives reopened a 42-year-old Oregon cold case. The Josephine County Sheriff's Office in Oregon says 72-year-old Mark Sanfratello is responsible for killing his then-girlfriend, Teresa Peroni, back in 1983.
Sometimes it takes 42 years for the truth to surface. Today, we're diving deep into a case that proves that no matter how much time passes, families never stop seeking answers, and law enforcement never stops pursuing justice. This is the story of Teresa Peroni, a 27-year-old woman who vanished into the Oregon wilderness on the 4th of July, 1983, and the man she was romantically involved with, who has finally been charged with her murder 4 decades later. This is a story about love turned deadly, a violent pattern that escalated, and DNA technology that brought closure to a family who waited nearly half a century for the truth. Picture this. It's Independence Day, 1983. The music is playing, people are celebrating America's birthday, and in the small town of Selma, Oregon, just 20 miles southwest of Grants Pass, a party is underway on Illinois River Road. The location is rural, surrounded by dense woods, and the kind of Oregon wilderness that can swallow secrets whole. Teresa Peroni arrives at this party with her boyfriend, 29 years old, Mark Sanfratello. She's 27 years old, with long, dark hair, blue eyes, and standing 5'4" tall. Friends describe her as a free spirit, someone who's been through hardships but maintained a loving heart despite everything life had thrown at her. But this wasn't going to be a night of celebration. What started as a 4th of July party would become the last time anyone would see Teresa Peroni alive. According to witness accounts and the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, tension had been building between Teresa and Mark throughout the evening. The argument centered on a devastating accusation. Mark believed Teresa was having an affair with another man, someone their friends nicknamed Rat Trap. The jealousy and suspicion that had been poisoning their relationship came to a head that night. Witnesses at the party watched as the argument escalated. Teresa and Mark stepped away from the crowd, walking together into the wooded area surrounding the property at 1270 River Road. It was a decision that would seal Teresa's fate. She walked into those woods with the man she was dating. She never walked out. When Teresa didn't return to the party, her family became concerned. Days passed, then weeks. Finally, Teresa's family reported her missing to the Josephine County Sheriff's Office. The investigation began immediately, but from the start, authorities knew something sinister had occurred. They classified Teresa's disappearance as suspicious in nature. But here's the devastating reality that Teresa's family had to face. Despite law enforcement's suspicions, despite Mark Sanfratello being the last person seen with Teresa, there simply wasn't enough evidence to file criminal charges. The case went cold, and Teresa's family was left with decades of agonizing questions and no answers. To understand the tragedy of what happened to Teresa Peroni, we need to understand who she was. Not just as a victim, but as a human being, with dreams, struggles, and people who loved her. Teresa's life had been marked by hardship from an early age. She and her brother, Russell Neal, grew up with an abusive stepfather, trauma so severe that both siblings ran away from home at different points during their childhood. This kind of early trauma often shapes how people navigate relationships for the rest of their lives, and Teresa's story is no exception. But Teresa was a survivor. She ran away to Texas, where she found love and got married in 1974 when she was just 18 years old. For a while, it seemed like she might have found stability and happiness, but life had other plans. While visiting family in California, Teresa was served with divorce papers. Her marriage was over, and once again, she was starting over. Adding to her challenges, Teresa suffered from epilepsy, a condition that caused her to have seizures and made it difficult for her to maintain steady employment. This medical condition left her vulnerable and dependent on others in ways that healthy people might not fully understand. After her divorce, Teresa made a decision that would prove to be transformative. She became involved with the church as part of her effort to rebuild her life. Her brother, Russell Neal, recalls attending her baptism with their mother and aunt. In a beautiful and symbolic moment, Russell was given the honor of submerging his sister in a creek during the ceremony. This was Teresa trying to turn her life around, seeking spiritual guidance and community after years of trauma and disappointment. Teresa eventually moved back to Oregon, where she would meet Mark Sanfratello. Friends described Teresa as having a loving nature despite all the hurt and damage she had experienced. Her brother Russell would later say of her, "She had a lot of hurt and damage done to her, but she still remained a loving person." But there were warning signs about the relationship that would ultimately cost Teresa her life. Her aunt had observed that Mark was really furious with her because she had joined the church. Think about that for a moment. A man becoming enraged because his girlfriend sought spiritual guidance and community support. This wasn't just jealousy. This was control. This was a man who couldn't tolerate his partner having independence, faith, or connections that didn't revolve around him. Teresa was described by those who knew her as someone who deserved better than what life had given her. She was trying to heal, trying to build something better for herself, but she had chosen to trust the wrong person. Mark Sanfratello wasn't just Teresa's boyfriend, he was a man with a documented history of violence against women. What happened to Teresa wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a terrifying pattern that would become crystal clear just 2 years after Teresa's disappearance. Mark and Teresa were part of a loosely organized communal living group connected to something called the People's Earth Park, which had originated in Bristol, Vermont. These kinds of alternative living arrangements were popular in the 1980s, attracting people seeking community and an alternative lifestyle. But for Teresa, what should have been a supportive community became the backdrop for a controlling and increasingly dangerous relationship. Friends and witnesses from their social circle reported that Teresa and Mark's relationship was volatile. Their verbal arguments would repeatedly escalate into violent exchanges. Several people noticed that Mark had a controlling nature, while Teresa maintained her free-spirited personality. This fundamental incompatibility, combined with Mark's jealousy and need for control, created a powder keg situation. The arguments weren't just occasional disputes, they were a regular pattern. Mark's suspicion that Teresa was involved with their mutual friend Rat Trap became an obsession. He couldn't let it go, couldn't trust her, and couldn't accept that she might have connections and friendships that didn't revolve around him. But the most chilling part of Mark Sanfratello's story comes after Teresa's disappearance. In August 1985, just 2 years after Teresa vanished, Mark was arrested in Eureka, California, for a horrific crime that would reveal the true extent of his capacity for violence. Mark had remarried and gained a stepdaughter, but instead of building a loving family, he brought terror into their home. According to law enforcement reports and court records, Mark stabbed both his new wife and her 14-year-old daughter in their own home. The teenage girl told investigators she had been beaten, choked, stabbed, and sexually assaulted by Marcus Sanfratello. Think about the parallels here. This wasn't a moment of passion or a crime of opportunity. This was a calculated, sustained attack on 2 vulnerable females in his household, his wife and a child he was supposed to protect as a stepfather. Mark was charged with 2 counts of attempted murder, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of burglary. He pleaded guilty to the attempted murder charges and received the maximum sentence, 15 years and 4 months in prison. The justice system finally caught up with Mark Sanfratello, but it came 2 years too late for Teresa Peroni. In 1997, a landowner near the location where Teresa had last been seen made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden in the Oregon wilderness, not far from where witnesses had seen Teresa walk into the woods with Mark Sanfratello, was a human skull. Law enforcement was called immediately. The Josephine County Sheriff's Office responded, and what followed was a careful and systematic search of the area. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search for additional remains, but despite thorough efforts, only the skull was recovered. No other bones, no clothing, no personal effects, just this single piece of evidence that might hold the key to solving Teresa's disappearance. In 1997, DNA technology wasn't what it is today. The testing capabilities that we now take for granted simply didn't exist. So the skull was labeled as belonging to a Jane Doe and sent to the FBI for whatever analysis was possible at the time. Investigators weren't sitting idle, though. They knew about Teresa's case, and the location of the skull so close to where she had vanished was too much of a coincidence to ignore. DNA samples were obtained from Teresa's sister to compare against the skull, but the technology of the time couldn't provide the definitive answer the family desperately needed. The sheriff's office began collecting additional DNA samples from people connected to Teresa. This process required tracking down family members, friends, and anyone who might provide genetic material that could be compared to the skull. After years of cold case inactivity, suddenly there was movement, hope, and the possibility of answers. These additional DNA samples were sent to the University of North Texas, where forensic geneticists could use modern testing methods that were unimaginable in 1997. The results were definitive and heartbreaking. The skull was indeed Teresa Peroni's, but DNA confirmation was just the beginning. The reopened investigation involved much more than scientific testing. Investigators began re-interviewing people who had been at that 4th of July party in 1983. They reviewed all the original evidence collected 40 years earlier. They looked for anyone who might have new information or memories that hadn't been shared with law enforcement at the time. Think about how challenging this process must have been. 40 years had passed. Some witnesses had died. Others had moved across the country. Memories had faded, and details that seemed insignificant in 1983 might now be crucial to building a case for prosecution. But the combination of modern forensic science and old-fashioned detective work created a compelling picture. The DNA evidence proved that Teresa was dead and that her remains were found near the last place she had been seen alive. On the 27th of June, 2025, a Josephine County grand jury reviewed all this evidence and made a historic decision. They indicted Mark Sanfratello, now 72 years old, for murder in the second degree in connection with Teresa Peroni's death. The decision by the Josephine County Sheriff's Office to reopen Teresa Peroni's case in February 2024 represents everything that's right about modern law enforcement's approach to cold cases. It shows what's possible when dedicated investigators refuse to give up, when new technology meets old-fashioned detective work, and when multiple agencies work together toward justice. Sheriff Dave Daniel and his small team of 26 people could have easily decided that Teresa's case was too old, too complicated, or too resource-intensive to pursue. For Teresa Peroni, for her family, and for all the victims of unsolved crimes, this case represents hope. Hope that the truth will eventually be known, that perpetrators will be held accountable, and that no victim will be forgotten, no matter how much time passes. Today, 42 years after she vanished, Teresa Peroni's story continues to unfold in a courtroom in Oregon, where justice delayed may finally become justice served.